Hey, Tim Clapham here with another tutorial for HelloLux.com, and this time what we're going to do is we're going to build a setup so that we can fly through some volumetric clouds, and to achieve this we're going to be using Pyrocluster. You don't see a lot of stuff out there for Pyrocluster. It's got a little bit of a reputation for being slow, but it doesn't necessarily have to be slow. There are ways to speed it up so you can preview your result fairly quickly, and you can always increase the quality of it at render time. As you can see in this scene here, what I've got is a spline, and I've drawn this, and what I'm going to do is add in a camera. To this camera I'm going to add an align to spline tag and drag this spline into this path, and then if we make this the active camera, we can of course drag the position, and we're traveling along that spline. Now you can't see that because we're inside the camera, but there we go from our top view. So the other thing that we probably want to do is check the tangential option, and that will mean that the camera is going to adjust its angle as it travels along that spline. So it's a fairly basic setup, but we can use this spline, and if we hold down Alt and come and add in a sweep, and then I'm going to hold down Shift and add a circle. Let's come back to our perspective view, and you can see that if I just come back to my editor camera, what we've got here is not really what we want. We have our circle in our sweep. It's no big deal, it just means that the circle is not set to the correct orientation. If we come down to the attribute manager, we can change the plane that it's on, maybe to X, Y, and that should work. And now we've got this tube, and if we come back to our camera, you can see that if we scrub the align to spline position value, that we travel through this tunnel. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this geometry to generate some particles, and we'll then use those with Pyrocluster. So it's probably a good idea to add some animation. So I'm going to set the project to be 400 frames, 0 to 399. On frame 0 I'm going to add a key for position at 0% on my align to spline tag, and then jump to the end and set this to be 100 and add another key. Now that means that I've kind of come out of the end of the sweep, but that doesn't matter. And you can see that we've got caps on there, so maybe what we want to do is select our sweep, switch to caps, and just set that to be none, so that we can fly through and out of our clouds. Okay, pretty cool stuff. Now the easiest way to generate particles across the surfaces is probably just to use MoGraph. So what we can do is we can hold down the Alt key, come to the MoGraph menu, and add in a matrix object. And the reason I've done that is just so that the matrix becomes the parent of the sweep. And if we then set this to object mode and generate thinking particles, let's grab our sweep nubs, drag it into the object field. And rather than placing them on the vertices, let's set that to be surface. Now because we're using thinking particles, you do need to jump forward and then jump back, and it resets the view. But we want more than 20. Let's set that up to be, say, maybe 800, something like so. And now if we press play, you can see we travel down through our pipe. Not the greatest animation in the world, but this should be enough to just give you an idea of the kind of look, and you can obviously spend a bit more time fine-tuning the smoothness of that path and the look of the overall flow. Now we've generated some particles along our tunnel, we can use those to position our Pyrocluster puffs, but of course before we could do that we need to bring in the Pyrocluster shader. So come down to the material manager, choose create shader, and add in Pyrocluster, and you can see that we've got two in here, volume tracer and Pyrocluster. We need to add both of those. First of all, Pyrocluster, which is the shader that generates the various types of puffs, and then we also add in a Pyrocluster volume tracer, and the volume tracer is used to place on an object to determine whereabouts Pyrocluster will be rendered. So you can place that on an object and it will only render Pyrocluster within that volume. Because we're going to be working with a whole environment, we need to make sure that Pyrocluster is rendered wherever it is in our environment. So of course we can use an environment object. So we add an environment object, we grab our Pyrocluster volume tracer, and we drop that on. We're working with thinking particles. Normally you would use a particle geometry object if you wanted to create geometry, and if you're working with Pyrocluster, you do exactly the same thing. So we come up to the simulate menu, choose thinking particles, add in particle geometry, and we add our shader to this. So we're not actually adding any geometry as such, but we're using the particle geometry object to assign our Pyrocluster shader. If we hit render now, we should see a result in our viewport, not necessarily anything too spectacular. One of the issues that I can already see is that we're rendering our sweep NURBS, and when we work with Pyrocluster in this kind of scene, we probably don't want to see the geometry that we're kind of creating our particles on. So I'm going to Alt double click to hide the matrix object and the sweep NURBS. Now when we render, we should see our puffs just sitting, floating in space. They're not looking too impressive at the moment. You can see it's also taking a little bit of time to render. Now we can speed that up, especially for working with previews, and it's probably an important feature to understand within Pyrocluster. And what we can do is we can adjust the world step size, and what that basically is the way that Pyrocluster works is that it takes slices through the environment or through the volume that you're working on, and we can specify the distance of each of those slices. If it had to trace the environment 100%, it would take forever. So to get around that, we slice that environment up. It's a bit like taking cross sections through an object, but the finer those cross sections, the more detail we're going to have, but of course the longer it's going to take. So if we make those cross sections further apart, we can get a result fairly quickly, and we can use that to kind of test our result. And then at render time, we can make that value smaller so that the slices or the steps between each trace is closer together and we get more detail. So if we come to our volume tracer here, you can see the render mode is set to crispy. If I just set that to user, that will give us access to all of these parameters, and you see here we've got world step size currently set to 5. So in other words, it's going to step 5 units for each trace. If we set that to 100 and render, you can see that we don't get much detail, but it renders really quickly. If we set this to maybe 25 and render, so we're seeing a lot of detail again now, and it's rendering fairly quickly. And if you compare that with a value of say 2, it's much slower, and we can still see reasonably well what's going on. In this example, we've got a lot more detail. It looks a little bit nicer, but with something like 25 in this scene, we can use that to kind of assess the shader and see how it's looking, and we can just reduce that value later on. In fact, probably one of the best things you can do when working with things like the world step size, the shadow map step size, and the ray trace step size is to use high values to start with, and half those values. And if when you half those values you're happy with it, then go somewhere in between the two and keep doing that. So you know, half the value and go in between each set of values until you find a sweet spot where it's rendering in a reasonable amount of time and the quality is sufficient for the project that you're working on. As well as the step size, which essentially slices the volume, we also have the ray transparency limit, and this is because what will happen is that Cinema will fire a ray through the volumes, and it will keep going until it reaches transparency. In other words, until it kind of gets to the other side of that puff. But very often we don't really need to see that much detail. We can probably get away with it stopping at a higher value, and if we set that value between say 1 and 10, it should speed things up as well. So I've set my world step size to 25, which is pretty high. I'll be lowering that down a little bit later. I'm also going to set my ray trans limit to 5. I'm going to set my shadow map step size to 10 with the trans limit to 5, and I'll do the same for the ray trace step size. All of these things will speed up our result, but they'll also make the quality a little bit lower. Okay, so that's enough of working with the volume tracer. Let's take a look at the Pyrocluster material itself. At the moment it's looking pretty poor. I've selected the material. One of the things that we might want to do is make those puffs a little bit bigger so they all intersect. If we look at the render, you can see they're very flat and white and they need some definition in the volume, but one thing at a time. Let's first of all switch to the shape tab. Now what we can do here is we can actually check the preview down here, and this will preview our Pyrocluster puffs in the viewport, which makes it a little bit easier to kind of see the size that they're going to be. I'm going to set these to be maybe 200, something like so. And now as we travel through, you can see we're kind of flying through the middle of these. Now we have got a maximum visible of 100. We could set that up to say 400, which would give us more of an idea of exactly what we're going to see. But we're actually got 800 on our object. But this gives you a little bit of an idea of how we're going to be flying through our clouds. So let's pick a spot somewhere like here, and let's just render and have a look. And you can see that there isn't much definition there, so we really need to do a little bit of work on these. Maybe we should make them a little bit smaller, so let's set these to say 175. But really the problem is that the illumination is so flat, it's almost like they're illuminant material. We need to have some kind of internal shadowing going on, and we need to have a little bit of color variation just so that they look that bit more interesting. Switch back to the Globals tab, and first of all, one of the things we can do is adjust the color. Now we have a gradient here, and if I fold this down, we can select the knots and we can adjust the color. Now this knot here on the left refers to the center of the puff, and this refers to the outer edge. Now I'm not going to do too much to this, but what I might do is just make it slightly colder and just a kind of light gray with a tiny little bit of blue in there, something like so. And you can see immediately that we have a more interesting looking puff here. We could maybe increase the luminosity 1 or 2% just so that it looks like there's a little bit of kind of self-illumination, or there's some light trapped inside that volume. The other thing that we could do is increase the density, and the density will determine how transparent our clouds are, and the more transparent they are, the slower it's going to render. And if we increase the density, let's set that to maybe 50, and you can see it becomes more solid. In fact, we could even set that up to maybe 100, something like so, and you can see it looks more like a kind of piece of cotton wool, and it's going to also render quicker by doing that. Let's just press F5 and have a quick look at the result now, and you can see we're starting to get a little bit more detail in there. Still quite tricky to see what's going on within that space. One of the things that we can do to help with this is to add in lights and maybe have some shadows and things like that, but that will also increase render time. But by adding in illumination, you really do change the total look of your setup. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a light, and I'm going to just pull this over here, maybe pull that up a bit. So we've got one light hitting down here. Let's just render now and have a quick look. Let's also grab this light and take it over to the other side, and let's pull it down so that we've got a light kind of hitting. In fact, let's make it a little bit lower, something like so. So we've just got a little bit more illumination going on over the whole thing. Now of course, having two lights at 100% intensity with no shadows is going to produce quite flat lighting in any scene. So of course we could adjust the color of our lights. Maybe we want to make one slightly warmer. Maybe we make this one, you know, a tiny little bit warmer, and we make this a little bit colder so that we have a tiny amount of difference between them. Of course we could add shadows, and we can select our Pyrocluster material. There's even a shadow tab, and we can enable receive and cast shadows, self-shadowing. All of those features do increase render times. One of the things that you can do to increase the look of this, or to make the look a little bit nicer, is to sort of cheat and add some ambient light into the shadows. If we set our transparency to maybe say 25 and add some ambient color in here, so let's just give this a kind of a blue shadow, something like so, and we start to see that blue in there. We still don't have enough definition in our puff, so we need to work on that a bit more. Let's switch to the illumination tab and enable illumination. Currently the mode is set to diffuse. If we set that to ray angle, we get much harder kind of illumination on our puff. And we can also add in some self-illumination and some transparency illumination here. You can see we're starting to get a little bit more definition. One of the other things that we can do to control that definition is to adjust the type of noise that's being used. And we have a few different noise types in here. I'm going to leave that on turbulence. Maybe come and adjust the scale, set that to say 400. Regularity is an interesting parameter that we can adjust here. If we set this higher, what it does is it controls the kind of feathering of the puff, and you can see as I set it higher, these look more and more like a sphere. If we set that to 100, you can see that it's basically rendering the sphere. And if you look in the viewport, all of our pyrocluster puffs are actually spheres. If we do the opposite and set this low and set it to something like 5, you can see that it really does break up the effect. And probably what we want to do is set that to maybe 10 or 15. So that we have quite broken up puffs. If we come back to the shadow tab, we also have the option down here for darken opacity. We can use this to lighten or darken our puffs based on how opaque or how transparent they are. If we just enable this, and let's just fold this up so we can see the preview. Dark factor is currently set to 50 with brightness of 0. If I increase the brightness, you can see that what happens is it makes our puff generally brighter. If we take the dark factor into negative values, you can see the result. These whiter areas are getting lighter. So I'm going to set this to 0 and I'm going to set the brightness to 50, and we shouldn't see any difference there. Now let's just take a look at our editor. If we render, and you can see it's starting to look quite nice. It's looking a little bit more like clouds now. Also, it rendered fairly quickly. Here you can see how this parameter actually works. If we set the dark factor up to say 50 and render, you can see that we've got a little bit more contrast. The whole thing looks a bit darker. If we set this to minus 50, now we've got these really nice bright spots. So that looks pretty nice, but it's obviously a little bit blown out. So I'm going to set that to be about minus 25 and maybe set the brightness value to be 25, and let's just have a look now. So you can see now we've kind of got those brighter areas. There's still a little bit blown out. In fact, let's set that to maybe 15 and render again, and let's set this to say minus 15. So you can see how important it is to get your previews fast. So it's good to get your volume tracer you know, with quite a large step size, but you do need to be careful, because if you have that step size too high, as soon as you adjust that and make it smaller, then the look will change considerably. Let's come back to our volume tracer now and set our world step size down to 10. So render times are going to increase a fair amount, but you can see that it definitely looks a little bit softer and a little bit more interesting. Now we don't have any shadows on our lights, and both lights are the same intensity. You know, haven't spent too much time on this, but you can see already that it's starting to look pretty nice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to render this out so we can have a look at the final result, and then you guys can take this tutorial even further by experimenting with your own type of pyrocluster looks. One thing we should note before we leave though is if we take a look at pyrocluster and we go to the globals parameter, if we just fold this up, you can see down here we've got an options for settings, and what I'm just going to save my project, but if we come here and choose, there are quite a few different options in here. So we could have chosen cloud to begin with. It asks you if you want to convert parameters, because you're basically loading a preset at this point. Let's just say yes for now and have a look at the result, and you can see that the result isn't looking very cloud-like, and if I render now you can see that I've totally messed up my whole setup. If we put maybe smoke and have a look, and you can see the result, and this is going to probably be fairly, it wasn't too slow at all, but none of these looks are looking as nice as the result I had from my save version. There we go. So that's starting to look pretty nice. Now you might want to add in a sky object so you don't get all of those black parts behind. I'm just going to add in a regular sky. Let's just create a new material, and on here let's just enable luminance, and in the luminance channel let's simply add in a gradient for now, and we can set this gradient to be on V, and start maybe at a kind of very light blue, and just go up to a slightly darker blue. So nothing too offensive. Maybe increase the turbulence a little bit so it's a bit broken up, and let's just drop that onto our sky, and now when we render we won't get those black holes. We'll have a sort of slightly blue sky showing through. As I say, I'm going to render this now and we'll have a look at the final result. So here's the final render, and you can see it's looking pretty nice. I mean, obviously there's a lot of room for improvement, but overall, at well under a minute a frame on my Mac Pro, rendered fairly fast. And of course, if we use real shadows, then it would probably look a little bit better. If we'd have lit it with a little bit more time and effort, that would have improved things. Maybe we could have cloned the particles across a landscape so it looked like we were flying across the top of the clouds rather than through a tunnel, which isn't particularly realistic. All the puffs are the same size. Maybe if some of them were slightly different sizes, it would be a bit more interesting. And we've got a few holes and things like that. But overall, you can see that we're getting a really nice volumetric feel as we kind of fly through. You know, the camera move is pretty clunky, but it should give you an idea of some of the possibilities of the kind of effects that you can achieve working with Pyrocluster. And it really doesn't necessarily have to be too slow. You know, I think this has got a lot of potential and it could look really nice. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and don't forget to head on over to hallolux.com for a lot more, and I'll catch you all next time. Thanks very much.